The word that ate the argument. How woke became a container for justice, grievance, bureaucracy, resentment, and the collapse of shared language. By Elias Winter, May 23, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. Opening. The word that explains too much. There are words that clarify reality, and there are words that absorb it. Woke has become the second kind. It is no longer a stable term. It does not point to one doctrine, one movement, one policy, one moral failure, or one political tribe. It has become a compression chamber for half the conflicts of contemporary American life. When someone says woke, they may mean racial justice, campus censorship, DEI bureaucracy, trans politics, corporate virtue signaling, anti-meritocratic hiring, historical guilt, elite hypocrisy, language policing, moral performance, or simply the vague feeling that the world has changed and nobody asked their permission. This is why the word is so powerful. It explains too much. A precise word helps us think. An overloaded word helps us avoid thinking. Woke now functions less as an argument than as a flare, a signal sent into the tribal sky. It tells us where the speaker stands before it tells us what the speaker means. The danger is not merely semantic. A society that loses the ability to distinguish between moral awareness and ideological coercion, between justice and bureaucracy, between compassion and performance, between grievance and historical memory, begins to lose the ability to govern itself. A word becomes dangerous when it stops naming reality and starts replacing the work of thought. Woke is one of those words now. It began as wakefulness, it became consciousness, then it became style, then procedure, then accusation, then insult. Now it is a whole collapsed argument packed into one syllable. To understand the word, we have to unpack the ruins inside it. 2. The original wakefulness. Before woke became an accusation, it was a warning. Its earliest political force came from Black American speech, where to stay woke meant to remain alert, to danger, to deception, to racial power disguised as normal life. It was not a lifestyle brand. It was not a campus slogan. It was not a human resources module. It was a survival instruction. To be woke was to know that danger often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. The word carried a kind of moral realism. It said, "Do not sleepwalk through the world as it is described by those who benefit from describing it. Do not confuse legality with justice. Do not mistake politeness for safety. Do not assume that institutions are innocent because their language is clean." In that original sense, wakefulness was not hysteria. It was perception sharpened by history. A society built on slavery, segregation, exclusion, and selective memory requires certain people to develop double vision. They must see both the official story and the machinery behind it. They must hear what is said and what is meant. They must learn which doors are open, which are decorative, and which are traps. That is the lost dignity of the word. Before it became a culture war object, woke named a form of attentiveness. It meant stay conscious in a world that profits from your sleep. That meaning should not be casually discarded. There are injustices that remain invisible precisely because the powerful call them normal. There are forms of danger that require vigilance to survive. There are social arrangements that can only be defended by asking the wounded to doubt their own perception. Wakefulness, in that sense, is not ideology. It is the refusal of enforced innocence. But no moral perception remains pure once institutions discover it. 3. The expansion. from alertness to moral system. The word expanded because the problem expanded. Or more precisely, the framework expanded. What began as alertness to racial injustice moved into a broader theory of structural power. Race, gender, sexuality, class, disability, colonialism, policing, language, representation, history, and institutional access were increasingly understood as interconnected systems rather than isolated prejudices. This expansion was not inherently absurd. Much of it was intellectually and morally necessary. A society can discriminate without announcing discrimination. A workplace can exclude without using slurs. A school can reproduce hierarchy while speaking the language of opportunity. A country can celebrate freedom while forgetting the people whose labor, land, and bodies made that freedom possible. Power is often most effective when it becomes atmosphere. The progressive impulse, at its best, tried to make invisible power visible. It asked, who is missing from the room? Whose pain is treated as anecdotal? Whose language is considered professional? Whose history is called divisive? Whose anger is pathologized? Whose comfort is protected by the accusation that everyone else is being too sensitive? These are not frivolous questions. They are civilizational questions. A society that cannot ask them becomes sentimental about itself. But attention can harden into doctrine. The moment moral perception becomes a total explanatory system, it begins to lose humility. It no longer asks where power is operating. It assumes power has already been mapped. It no longer listens for complexity. It assigns roles: victim, oppressor, ally, colonizer, marginalized, privileged, unsafe, harmful, centered, erased. These words may reveal something. They may also replace the person standing in front of us. That is the first corruption. When categories built to expose dehumanization become capable of dehumanizing in return. The second corruption is institutional. Once universities, corporations, nonprofits, foundations, media organizations, and government agencies adopted the vocabulary of justice, the language changed again. It no longer belonged only to activists, writers, students, or communities trying to name their conditions. It became professionalized. The moral vocabulary became administrative. And once conscience becomes administrative, it begins to behave like administration. 4. The bureaucratization of conscience. Institutions do not know how to love justice, so they manufacture procedures that imitate it. This is the heart of what many people now mean when they complain about wokeness. They are not always objecting to moral awareness itself. Often they are reacting to the bureaucratization of moral life, the transformation of conscience into compliance. The signs are everywhere. The mandatory training that reduces history to a set of approved responses. The DEI statement that asks not what a person has done, but whether they can speak the institutional dialect. The campus policy that cannot distinguish between harassment and discomfort. The corporate email that mourns injustice in perfect brand voice. The land acknowledgement delivered by an institution that has no intention of returning anything. The hiring rubric that quietly turns moral vocabulary into a credential. The administrator who treats reputational risk as ethical urgency. The public ritual in which everyone says the correct thing and nobody is changed. This is not justice. It is moral risk management. The institution does not become brave. It becomes fluent. It learns the language of vulnerability, equity, harm, inclusion, trauma, and belonging. But too often, the language functions as insulation. It allows the institution to appear morally awake while remaining structurally asleep. The corporation can celebrate inclusion while suppressing wages. The university can denounce privilege while charging impossible tuition. The nonprofit can speak of community while exploiting the emotional labor of its staff. The elite institution can confess complicity in beautiful prose while preserving every mechanism of selection that produced its power. Here the conservative critique finds real material. Not all of it, but enough. There is something grotesque about institutions discovering moral language only after that language becomes useful for legitimacy. There is something spiritually deadening about watching justice become a style guide. There is something false in a moral culture where the right words can substitute for costly action. But the critique often goes wrong by treating the corruption as the essence. It sees the HR module and declares justice itself a fraud. It sees the performative land acknowledgement and dismisses the history beneath it. It sees an absurd campus controversy and concludes that racism is imaginary, that exclusion is invented, that all demands for dignity are merely strategies for power. That is the trap. The bureaucratization of conscience deserves criticism. But bureaucracy is not the same thing as conscience. The failure of institutional language does not mean the wound it imitates is unreal. The task is not to choose between moral blindness and moral theater. The task is to recover moral seriousness from the institutions that have learned to counterfeit it. 5. The conservative counter-grievance. Conservatives often complain that woke politics is obsessed with identity, grievance, victimhood, and moral coercion. Sometimes they are right. There are versions of progressive politics that do sacralize marginality. There are environments where injury becomes status, disagreement becomes harm, language becomes surveillance, and moral authority is distributed according to proximity to suffering. There are activists and institutions that speak as if the world can be divided cleanly into the stained and the innocent. But the right often answers this with its own identity machine. It condemns identity politics while practicing identity politics under universal names. It says, real Americans. It says, parents. It says, taxpayers. It says, the heartland. It says, Western civilization. It says, law and order. It says, tradition. It says, normal people. It says, our way of life. Not all of these phrases are racial. Not all are cynical. Many refer to real attachments: family, place, religion, work, continuity, duty, memory. A society that treats these attachments with contempt should not be shocked when they return as rage. But in American politics, these phrases often carry racial and cultural freight. They can become ways of saying white without saying white, Christian without saying Christian, male without saying male, native-born without saying native-born. They allow a majority identity to present itself as neutral reality, while treating other identities as divisive intrusions. This is the mirror. The left says, historically marginalized people are still harmed by structural injustice. The right says, ordinary Americans are being displaced, silenced, mocked, and punished by elites and minorities. The left sacralizes marginality. The right sacralizes lost centrality. Both stories can contain real wounds. Both can also become machines. White grievance politics is not simply white supremacy, though it can overlap with it. It is often more psychologically subtle. It is the feeling of dispossession among people who once experienced their culture as the default setting of the nation. They may not think of themselves as racial actors. They may think of themselves as normal people watching normalcy collapse. This is why anti-woke rhetoric is so emotionally potent. It is not only about policy, it is about status, humiliation, memory, and loss. It says, they took your country. They took your language. They took your children's schools. They took your jokes. They took your heroes. They took your authority. They took your innocence. And now they call you hateful for noticing. That story is powerful because it converts change into theft. It also allows conservatives to mock victimhood while cultivating their own version of it. The anti-woke subject is not merely a citizen with arguments. He is aggrieved, betrayed, censored, replaced, despised. He is the last sane man in an empire of madness. This does not make left and right identical. They are not. The histories are different. The power relations are different. The moral claims are different. But grievance does not disappear when it changes uniforms. A politics that defines itself against identity can still be possessed by identity. A politics that mocks fragility can still be organized around wounded pride. A politics that denounces moral coercion can still practice coercion in the name of tradition, religion, nation, or normalcy. The right sees the left's idol clearly. It often cannot see its own. 6. Campus speech as the test case. The university is where these contradictions become visible, because the university is supposed to be the place where words still matter. It is supposed to pursue truth through argument. That requires freedom. The freedom to ask, to doubt, to offend, to revise, to encounter difficult material, to hear arguments one finds ugly or wrong, and to answer them without demanding institutional rescue. But universities are also moral communities. They are not abstract debating chambers floating above history. Students arrive with bodies, identities, wounds, fears, and unequal burdens. Speech does not happen in a vacuum. A classroom is not a comment section. A campus is not a battlefield where the strongest lungs deserve victory. So the conflict is real. On one side is the free inquiry model. Bad ideas should be answered, not banned. On the other side is the harm reduction model. Some ideas reproduce exclusion, humiliation, and threat, and institutions have a responsibility to protect students from hostile environments. Both models contain truth. Both contain danger. Free inquiry without moral seriousness can become cruelty. It can turn the classroom into a theater where the already exposed are asked to endure one more abstraction about their humanity. It can disguise domination as debate. It can treat the powerful speaker and the vulnerable listener as if history has not entered the room. But harm reduction without epistemic humility can become orthodoxy. It can turn discomfort into injury, injury into veto, and veto into power. It can make inquiry impossible by treating certain conclusions as violence before they are even examined. It can teach students that the highest form of moral agency is not argument, but complaint. A university cannot survive if every wound becomes a veto and every question becomes violence. The campus speech controversies that get labeled woke usually emerge from this confusion. A speaker is disinvited. A professor is investigated. A student is reported for bias. A classroom discussion becomes an administrative proceeding. A quotation is treated like an endorsement. A clumsy argument becomes a moral crime. A joke becomes a case file. A disagreement becomes harm. Then the backlash arrives, often with its own bad faith. Conservatives who never cared about academic freedom discover it when their speakers are disrupted. Politicians who denounce campus censorship pass laws telling professors what they cannot teach. People who claim to defend free inquiry use the state to regulate inquiry in the other direction. Thus, the university is squeezed between two censorious impulses: activist moral protection and reactionary political control. One says, protect students from harmful ideas. The other says, protect the nation from dangerous educators. Neither is the university's highest calling. The university exists to keep thought alive under pressure. That means protecting people from threats and harassment. It does not mean protecting them from difficulty, ambiguity, offense, or the burden of argument. If the university loses that distinction, it becomes either a therapy bureaucracy or a nationalist training center. Both are betrayals. 7. The real crisis: language without trust. The deeper crisis is not the word woke. The deeper crisis is that public language has lost trust. Words no longer clarify. They recruit. They do not describe. They sort. They do not invite thought. They demand allegiance. Woke is only one example. So is freedom. So is democracy. So is safety. So is violence. So is merit. So is equity. So is patriotism. So is truth. Each side accuses the other of corrupting language. Each is correct. Each is guilty. Progressive institutions stretch words like harm and violence until ordinary disagreement becomes morally suspect. Conservative movements stretch words like freedom until public health, civil rights, or historical memory can be treated as tyranny. One side turns emotional discomfort into danger. The other turns social responsibility into oppression. Language becomes less a medium of truth than a weapon of belonging. Once that happens, definition becomes almost impossible. The word no longer asks, "What is true?" It asks, "Whose side are you on?" This is why woke can mean everything and nothing. Its ambiguity is not a flaw in political rhetoric. It is the source of its power. The word allows the speaker to summon a whole atmosphere without proving a specific claim. It activates memory, resentment, fear, disgust, recognition, fatigue. A parent hears woke and thinks of schools. A professor hears it and thinks of censorship. A black activist hears it and thinks of stolen language. A corporate executive hears it and thinks of reputational danger. A conservative voter hears it and thinks of elite contempt. A progressive organizer hears it and thinks of backlash against justice. A comedian hears it and thinks of forbidden jokes. A student hears it and thinks of moral surveillance. An administrator hears it and thinks of liability. One word, many ghosts. This is what happens in an exhausted empire. Language becomes crowded with unresolved conflict. No argument is allowed to remain itself. Every dispute becomes symbolic of every other dispute. A school curriculum becomes the fate of the nation. A pronoun becomes civilization. A hiring policy becomes racial revenge. A joke becomes fascism. A statue becomes history itself. A word becomes the battlefield on which an entire society tries to settle accounts it cannot even name. The collapse of shared language is not a side effect of polarization. It is one of its engines. When words lose precision, power gains room. Institutions hide behind moral vocabulary. Politicians hide behind grievance vocabulary. Citizens stop asking what is meant. They ask only whether the word belongs to their side. Then speech becomes ritual, and thought begins to starve. 8. Conclusion: wakefulness without idolatry. The answer is not to become woke in the bureaucratic sense. The answer is not to become anti-woke in the lazy sense. Both are too easy. The harder task is wakefulness without idolatry. To stay awake to injustice without turning victimhood into sainthood. To name power without reducing every person to a category. To defend speech without becoming indifferent to cruelty. To pursue inclusion without manufacturing ideological tests. To honor historical wounds without building an identity out of grievance. To resist elite moral theater without denying the realities it imitates. To protect institutions from capture without handing them over to reaction. To preserve language as an instrument of truth rather than a badge of tribe. Wakefulness is still necessary. There are things a decent society must learn to see. The afterlives of domination, the hypocrisies of merit, the cowardice of institutions, the unequal distribution of danger, the way normal life can conceal organized abandonment. But wakefulness must remain a discipline of perception, not a machinery of accusation. It must resist the pleasure of purity. It must refuse the intoxication of belonging to the righteous. It must remember that every moral language can become a costume for power. It must know that the oppressed can speak falsely, the privileged can speak truthfully. Institutions can say beautiful things for ugly reasons, and grievances can be real without being sovereign. The word woke was once tied to the command to keep one's eyes open. That command is still worth hearing. But to be truly awake now is not merely to see injustice where others deny it. It is also to see when the language of justice has become performance, when resistance has become branding, when critique has become identity, when anti-wokeness has become its own grievance cult, and when a word has eaten the argument it was supposed to begin. To stay awake is not to join a tribe. It is to keep seeing after the slogans have done their damage. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.